Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
I want to thank all of you for being here with me today in our council chambers. I've called this press conference to announce that I will be introducing this Thursday in City Council chambers a piece of legislation that will create a new office called the Office of Victim Advocate here in the city of Philadelphia. I want to first and foremost thank my colleagues for joining me. I want to thank Councilwoman Catherine Gilmore Richardson. I want to thank Councilwoman Kendra Brooks, who have been working with me on the special committee on gun violence, specifically the subcommittee on victims, co-victims, and survivors of gun violence. And so I thank them for being here with me today as well. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge Ms. Felicia Pendleton, who runs an organization called Mothers United by Angels, Ms. Alita Garcia, who you will hear from, who runs the National Homicide Justice Alliance, and she's also a co-chair of the subcommittee on victims and co-victims of gun violence on the special committee on gun violence. And I also want to acknowledge Ms. Dorothy Johnson Spike, founder of Mothers in Charge, who's the co-chair of victims and co-victims of subcommittee on gun violence. And I also want to acknowledge Mr. Stanley Crawford, who also runs the Black Male Community Council here in the city of Philadelphia, and also the other advocates who are here around addressing this very critical, important issue. The legislation I will introduce this Thursday will create the Office of Victim Advocates and will have the powers and duties that include the following: advocate for victims and co-victims, indirect victims of crime such as family members, neighbors, and other community members, lead coordination planning within government and non-governmental partners, provide training and technical assistance for those who serve or otherwise interact with victims, ensure notification and enforcement of the rights of crime victims, serve as a liaison between the victim and co-victim in the community and city government, educate the public on victims' rights, review relevant audits by the city controller, investigate complaints regarding interactions with victims and co-victims by government and government-funded agencies, and develop policy to advocate on behalf of victims of crimes. The new Philadelphia Victim Advocate will offer as a hub for crime victims, survivors, and others affected by crime. The office functions would include coordination, planning, and oversight. I am calling for the creation of this new office within the city of Philadelphia to work on system-wide issues affecting victims and co-victims of crime and gun violence. The advocates have told me that the fragmented nature of victim services leads to a lack of consistency and timing of outreach and services provided. The new Office of Victim Advocate is long overdue here in the city of Philadelphia. The creation of this office was among the recommendations I heard from Philadelphians during recent hearings conducted by City Council Special Committee on Gun Violence, in which I chair, to examine the effect of gun violence on victims and co-victims, as well as the resources available to them. I am the chairman of that subcommittee, and I am committed to making sure that victims have a voice at the table. The council hearings on the impact of gun violence have given the victims and co-victims of gun violence a chance to voice their concerns and discuss what resources the city of Philadelphia are providing to support them. That hearing took place approximately 2 weeks ago in this very same chamber that we are here today, that we are in today, and we heard the victims and co-victims and family members of gun violence voices loud and clear. It is no mistake that I'm introducing legislation this Thursday during the same time that our budget hearings will be taking place regarding the 2000-2001 multi-billion-dollar operating budget proposal. And that as a part of that budget process, I will advocate to make sure that there's funding available if this legislation is approved by the voters, in which will vote on this ballot question, which will be in the November 2020 general election. And I want to make sure that this ballot question, once it's approved and this office is created, it has the necessary funding to start immediately. Our murder rate here in the city of Philadelphia is too high, and victims need an official advocate within the city of Philadelphia to make sure that their voices are heard. As of March Second, 64 people have been the victims of homicides here in the city of Philadelphia, a 25% increase compared to the same time in 2019. According to statistics here in the city of Philadelphia Police Department website, in 2019, Philadelphia recorded 356 homicides. That total marked the highest homicide count over a decade and was higher than 353 homicides recorded in 2018. Almost all those homicides were committed with firearms, and people of color are disproportionately likely to be victims or co-victims of gun violence. In addition to those being murdered in our city, there were also more than 1,400 non-fatal shootings here in the city of Philadelphia. The victims of violence often suffer long-term disability, including paralysis, organ malfunction, and chronic pain. And so it's important that we advocate and make sure that individuals who work in this field, which we call boots on the ground organizations, specifically working to support those who are victims and advocates and survivors of gun violence, we want to make sure they have the necessary support that they need. We want to make sure that this office also streamlines all of the city agencies that provide victim advocate services in one hub in which we can all be on the same page in making sure that the people most important in this process, when we talk about gun violence, when we talk about crime, have a voice at the table when we talk about policy and resources, and that's the family members of those who have been victims of gun violence and those who are victims of crime. Before I turn it over to the people who are most important regarding the advocacy around this particular topic, I do want to say that we have the support of the Commonwealth Pennsylvania victim advocate, Ms. Jennifer Storm. She has endorsed the creation of this new position. The Pennsylvania Office of Victim Advocate was established in 1995 and diligently works to provide victims of crime with notifications, support, and advocacy services. Ms. Storm was unable to join us today for this press conference, but she also sent over an official statement regarding her support for the creation of this new office. I want to also acknowledge Mr. Michael Lee, who also came here to be present from the District Attorney's Office regarding this press conference, and we're going to work with all city stakeholders regarding not only the creation of this new office, but also the collaboration and partnership with the various agencies that have jurisdiction over those who are victims, co-victims, and survivors of gun violence. And so for me, this issue isn't about politics. Most people know that I've been doing this work prior to me becoming a council person starting in 1998 when a cousin of mine was murdered in the streets of South Philadelphia. And so I've been a lifelong advocate addressing the issue of gun violence. But I also know when we talk about this issue, it's very, very important that the victims, co-victims, survivors of gun violence, their family members, they have a seat at the table. And oftentimes they don't, to be quite frank with you. But through the Special Committee on Gun Violence, we have some strong advocates who have been working to make sure we address this issue. And so I want to invite up the co-chair of the subcommittee on gun violence, Ms. Dorothy Johnson Spite. She's the founder of Mothers in Charge.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I want to first of all thank Councilman Kenyatta Johnson for this. This, as was stated, is long, long overdue. I founded Mothers in Charge almost 17 years ago and have been wanting to see something like this put in place for that long, because I've heard from the victims for that number of years who felt that they didn't have a voice, that no one cared. I remember when my son was murdered, I kept thinking that someone from the city would come and extend something, a service, a condolence, or something. It never happened. So this is long overdue, and who best could advocate for victims, co-victims, and survivors of violence than those who are most impacted by it? So this is something that I'm so glad to see happening, and Kenyatta Johnson, you have the support of all of us here, because we feel that you understand firsthand, and you're showing that. It's not just about words, but it's about actions. And this action today speaks loudly about your concern and your care for us and what is happening in the city of brotherly love and sisterly affection with over 60-some murders this year. So thank you again for what you're doing. We really appreciate you. Thank you so much.
Next, I would like to ask to come up Ms. Alita Garcia from the National Homicide Justice Alliance. Also co-chair, yes, of the Special Committee on Gun Violence. She's subcommittee chairwoman of the Special Committee on Gun Violence, specifically dealing with victims, co-victims of gun violence. And the reason why that has to be acknowledged because when we first started the Special Committee on Gun Violence, these two leaders have been advocating, but most importantly, challenging not only myself, but my peers to make sure that we're doing everything possible to make sure that they have and their advocacy has a voice in this process. So I thank you for your leadership, and I thank you for your leadership, and also your patience in making sure we continue to move the ball forward in terms of progress around this issue. Thank you.
I want to thank Councilman Kenyatta Johnson for listening to the victims. I agree with Dorothy Johnson-Spite that this is something that needs to happen. I'm glad it happened now. It's a good day in Philadelphia, knowing that someone in the city will be directly responsible for advocating for victims. The District Attorney's Office advocates for the Commonwealth. The Public Defender advocates for the defendant. We need someone to advocate for us. Someone that will understand, and the people standing behind me have worked very long and hard to get to where we are now, and we're beginning to see progress in the city. And I really want to thank Councilman Kenyatta for leading this effort and for making the changes that we need to see in Philadelphia.
Another part of this conversation is regards to how do we provide support services, funding, resources for the organizations that are actually out there on the ground. When a homicide takes place, these are the individuals who reach out to the family. When there's trauma inside the schools because a young person sees someone get murdered, like we recently saw up in North Philadelphia, who goes into the school and talk to the children? I'm going to bring up Ms. Shantae Love from an organization called Amir, Every Murder is Real, to speak on the work that she has been doing and regarding what we're doing today.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity to talk. This is an exciting day, and I'm looking forward to how we work together. Emir Healing Center works with community members in different facets, not only in schools, blocks, homes. The Office of Victim Advocate for the city, as we gather people and we collaborate together, that it should have a voice. I am in awe that we're able to pull something together because there are stakeholders not only from the city groups, there are stakeholders that are funded by the state, there are stakeholders all across, and if we can all come together to have a dialogue, that when I will always say, equity at the table means all of our ideas, our resources, us coming together, that what if we had those parties? Could we save a city? Could we save a race? Thank you.
Before we open it up for questions, I want to allow a gentleman, and if you're paying attention to the advocates that are behind me, he's actually the minority that's standing up here today, and I thought it's only right that he gets acknowledged because oftentimes, I mean, you know, women have been leading the way, and y'all have been leading the way. But this gentleman, and unfortunately he's put in this position to advocate on such an issue, has been stomping the grounds on the streets, and he will tell you his own story. Mr. Stanley Crawford, I'm going to ask to please come on up and just talk about what your organization has been doing and the name of your organization.
Good afternoon, and I thank the Councilman Kenyatta Johnson. When we was here for the hearing, I can now see that it wasn't a fruitless hearing, because out of this we now have this structure that is coming through the councilman that is much needed. Over the 8th of this month would be 18 months since my son was murdered. And as a result of his murder, we created what we call the Black Male Community Council of Philadelphia. And I started recognizing, just being up here, the only male present, that that was a much needed organization and need to be able to create a structure with men like myself who are enduring the experience of having their loved one murdered, that we come together and be a part of this whole action plan. One thing I say this about this, but what's taking place today, I do the math on the year my son was murdered. 351 people was murdered. 60% of them went unsolved. That's 211 families of members that don't know what happened to their loved ones. So when we create this structure that is being created here, it gives us an opportunity to advocate on behalf of our loved ones, because they're not here to advocate for themselves. It's a duty and a responsibility we owe to them to do what this bill is calling to be done, is to be the advocate for our loved ones that's not able to advocate for themselves. So I thank the council, man, and I thank the council as a whole to even bringing this to us and give us an opportunity to use this instrument to be able to help, number one, solve some of these murders, and number two, to work together to support each other. Thank you.
No, thank you. So before I open up, I just want to say, I want to thank the advocates for their courage and their strength. Unless you've lost a loved one, you won't really fully comprehend the courage that it takes to keep on getting up and moving forward and fighting the good fight on behalf of your loved ones and your family members. And so I thank all of them. I appreciate them for being out. At this time, I'm going to open it up for any questions from the press, and thank everyone for coming out here today. The package will be introduced tomorrow in City Council session. Again, it will be on a November ballot, the same time as the presidential election. But for me, this is a no-brainer. These advocates have also educated me about the process. We want to look at what's the relationship between the homicide unit and the family members of those who have lost their lives to gun violence. What's the notification process? We know what happens on the state, but how is that being enforced in partnership with the city of Philadelphia when someone takes the life of another person and they do time and they come back out on the street? Is that family properly notified? These advocates have educated me on why this office is so important to make sure that we're advocating on behalf of them and making sure that their issues are properly being addressed. And so with that being said, thank everyone for being here. Any questions from members of the press? If not, I'll turn it over. Yes, sir.
A number of questions. First,
Yes, sir.
how many agencies would this advocate try to coordinate? I mean, how large is this infrastructure that they would coordinate?
Well, first and foremost, when you look at the key organizations that provide services around victim services, we want to look at organizations that receive funding from the city of Philadelphia. I can name at least 6 off the top of my head that receive funding from the city of Philadelphia's budget. We will also work in partnership with the Philadelphia Police Department. We will also work in partnership with the Office of Violence Prevention, and we will also work in partnership in collaboration with the District Attorney's Office as a start, because we know that these are the organizations that are on the ground doing work that directly impacts victims and co-victims of the virus of gun violence.
So that's probably at least close to 10.
Yes.
And no more. Why, Councilman, why not try to strengthen and streamline city government
Yes.
versus making
Yes.
hiring
Yes.
yet another person?
Yes.
Why not
And
bang
yes,
everyone
thank you.
before bang?
Yes, I'll tell you why. Because the advocates behind me, and they can attest to this to themselves, when we talk about the issue of criminal justice, it's such a broad spectrum of issues that need to be addressed. Some people talk about violence prevention. Some people talk about anti-violence initiatives. Some people talk about criminal justice reform. But as Felicia Pennington will tell you, oftentimes when we talk about all of the issues under the sun, you know who voices get lost in that process? Victims, co-victims, and survivors of gun violence. And so we thought it was critically important to specifically zero in on those individuals who has lost loved ones to gun violence, those who have been severely impacted by gun violence, and those who are victims of gun violence and crime. And so we want to have a specific area that we want to zero focus in on, and only this office will specifically address just that issue.
Just a couple more.
Sure.
The district attorney, district attorney represents victims. He prosecutes criminals.
Yes.
And victims come to testify.
Yes.
Why can't his office be more aggressive and forward-leaning for victims? Are they failing at that? Is the DA's office failing at that?
I can't speak to, well, one, I wouldn't say they're failing, so I'm not going to have him in the record saying his office is failing. I know they provide victim services the same way the city of Philadelphia provide victims advocates when a homicide takes place. This is for us to coordinate and make sure that everyone is on the same page when it comes to addressing this particular issue. So we're going to work in partnership and collaboration with the district attorney's office, but also the Philadelphia Police Department has a role to play as well. When you talk about the homicide clearance rate, when you talk about the victim services that actually takes place after a homicide takes place, that's what the police department as well. And so we just want to make sure that we're co-coordinating all those services together. So I wouldn't say there's a failure on his behalf or the police behalf. We just want to make sure we're all working and collaborating together.
What's the cost?
We don't have a particular budget number at the moment, but I will begin after I introduce this bill tomorrow, and we look at this upcoming budget to make sure that we're advocating for funding to at least start staffing up after this bill is approved by the public after November.
Last one. I mean, your committee was, it's a subcommittee, correct?
Yes.
And it was a committee for...
I chair the special committee on gun violence, but we have a subcommittee on victims, co-victims, and survivors of gun violence.
This coordinator is not going to stop any gun violence in the city of Philadelphia, right? And this doesn't stop gun violence.
Our purpose is to make sure that the victims, the survivors of gun violence, has a voice while we're addressing the issue of gun violence, while we're talking about policy, right? So if a loved one is lost.
Have we addressed gun violence in the city in any way?
Oh, yes, we have, through the Special Committee on Gun Violence, yes.
356 last year. 356.
Yes.
Arise, you talked about it yourself. We're at 60, I think we're 65.
Yes.
25%.
Yes.
Gun violence.
Yes, I will say this, Jeff. Obviously, we should be doing much, much more, right? But I can speak to the work that I have done as a council person through the Special Committee on Gun Violence. I remember when I first created the Special Committee on Gun Violence, the homicide clearance rate was much lower than it is now. And as a result of Alita Garcia, who's standing here, and also Ms. Dorothy, they advocated around this issue, right, in which we expanded the level of homicide detectives in the Philadelphia Police Department, which we believe contributed to increasing the homicide clearance rate. We also made sure that we increased the budget for the Office of Violence Prevention, which now we have crisis intervention teams that are on the streets addressing the issue of gun violence. And so through the committee, we've advocated through City Council on a variety of different initiatives, but I will definitely agree with you, Jeff. We should be doing a whole lot more in the city of Philadelphia when it comes to addressing this issue of gun violence. And where are the guns coming from? That's another issue we need to address as well. With that being said, thank you everyone for coming out here today, and to all the advocates, we appreciate you, and we're going to be here with you all along the way as we address this issue. Thank you very much, everyone. Vincent?